Alrighty, we're going to get started on the section of the forum for our 13th Ward candidate who is here tonight. Thank you, Paul Bruton, for attending. We really appreciate it. The 13th Ward covers West Lawn, West Elsden, Clearing, and Garfield Ridge. The forum will be the same. You'll have 90 seconds to respond to each question. To keep it consistent, we're going to do a 60-second closing remarks at the end. So with that, we'll jump right into it. The Southwest Side is heavy on industry, and Midway Airport and railroads in the 13th Ward are a prime example. What would you do as alderman to help mitigate the environmental effects of industry in your neighborhoods?
Thank you to Southwest Collective for hosting this. This is a great event, and I'm very happy to be here. We don't do a lot of this on the Southwest Side, so I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to talk to you all. We haven't invested a lot in non-car infrastructure. You know, we don't have a lot of bike lanes. We don't have a lot of pedestrian-friendly infrastructure. I think that's something we can do to help cut down on traffic. I'd like to see a lot more trees in the area. If you look at the City of Chicago Climate Action Plan, they have sort of a tree canopy map you can look at, and we're below average in the 13th Ward. We've had, I think, a lot of trees cut down over the last couple of decades, and I'd like to replace them, and that's something that can mitigate some of the worst air pollution. But I do think, we're always going to have some traffic around Midway Airport. There's no way around that. But I think building out the infrastructure so that we're not relying on cars as much as we can, knowing that many of us still will, but trying to reduce that, and then also, improving the sort of green space and the tree canopy in the area. I think that would go a long way towards mitigating that.
Knowing that Chicago politics is a complicated system, how would you go about building the necessary relationships and alliances to effectively provide for the 13th Ward?
So that's a great question, and that's something that I hear from a lot of voters. So for those of you who don't know, running in the 13th Ward, I'm running against what remains of the Mike Madigan machine, right? The 13th Ward is Mike Madigan's home ward. He remains the Democratic committeeman, even though he's facing now 23 federal counts of racketeering and bribery. Marty Quinn is one of Mike Madigan's top lieutenants, and so there's this element where there's an attitude that they know everybody, right? They have all these relationships, they can make all these deals, and there's some element of truth to that, but I'm prepared to talk to anyone. I'll talk to everybody on the Southwest Side, across the city of Chicago. We've got a lot of big problems that go, as some of the previous candidates said, go beyond ward boundaries. So trying to, find collaborative solutions to those problems. I think for a long time, the 13th Ward has been very insular and very isolated, and that's something I'd like to change. I'd like to sort of turn outward and really talk to everybody across the city of Chicago and find some big solutions to things. So I want to build those relationships. I'm not with any particular political organization, so I don't know a ton of people, but I've worked in government before. I've talked with a lot of different folks, and I think I can build those relationships fairly easily.
Thank you. Next question. The Orange Line is a major line directly to and from Midway Airport, but also a way of commuting for folks every single day. With ridership down and crime up, how would you improve the CTA experience for everyone?
It's a great question. So I have a lot of experience having ridden the Orange Line. There were various points in my life where I was commuting on the Orange Line very regularly, sometimes Orange Line to Blue Line or Orange Line to a bus, or a couple of different things I've done. So I understand what that experience is like. The CTA I actually think that the Orange Line, compared to a lot of the CTA system, is doing pretty well right now. That doesn't mean we can't make improvements, but I think the system as a whole, we've got to find ways to boost ridership. The complaints are all about safety and cleanliness, so we need to address those. That's gonna, if we can make people feel safer, if we can make the trains cleaner and more pleasant, that's going to bring riders back. I think some of that's also going to be, as time passes and we get further, as we move further past COVID, we're going to see some of that return as people get back to the office a little more regularly. But that doesn't mean we can't actively work on it. And I think there's a lot. I have I'm going to throw this out there. This is something I've heard talked about. I'm not committing to this right now, but I've heard some discussions about fare-free transit as a solution to try to get people back onto CTA. The fares do not provide as much of the CTA budget as you might think. It's about 18% of the overall CTA budget. It's about $300 million a year, so it's not nothing.
Just a couple more seconds.
But if we can find a revenue source for that, we might be able to cut fares or even eliminate fares altogether, which I think would do a lot for that.
Thank you. Next question. How would you improve pedestrian and cyclist safety among high traffic areas of the 13th Ward, like roads heading into Midway, but also residential roads right off of major intersections?
Yeah, this is great. So, I've been walking the precincts, talking to voters, and I hear, there were a lot of things I expected to hear. Traffic safety is a concern I've heard from a lot of voters that was not one I necessarily expected to be a huge concern. Pulaski and 63rd Street in particular is one I've heard a lot of people. You've got drivers going down Pulaski, they're doing 50, 60 miles an hour on Pulaski. They make a turn into the neighborhood, they come barreling down 64th Street or wherever, and they're still doing 50 or 60 miles an hour. So the question is, what can we do to slow down drivers? And the answer is there's quite a bit. So there's what are called traffic calming devices. There's a lot of different things you can do. You can do curb bump outs. You can do raised crosswalks. There's different kinds of infrastructure you can build. I'd like to see, particularly the raised crosswalks, I think would be really effective in that area. If you had, so they're kind of like a big speed bump, essentially, that is where the crosswalk is. And it keeps pedestrians up a little higher, and it forces drivers to slow down as they cross that area. I think having those as the first crosswalk as you're coming off of major arterials would force drivers to slow down and would hopefully keep that speed down as they move through the residential areas. So I do know that Pulaski south of Archer is one that CDOT has identified as a high crash corridor. So there's definitely some things we can do there. That's an area I'm looking at, and that's something to be concerned about.
How would you improve school infrastructures in the ward?
So this is another one I hear from people a lot. We do have a couple of schools in the ward that are new, but we also have a couple of schools that are not new at all. I see some of them, and they've got the mobile classrooms, right? The extensions, the add-on classrooms, and they've had them for years, right? And so that's a clear indication that school needs more space, right? We need to build out some of those schools so that they have a larger building, right? They clearly need that. I've seen that in other nearby areas where we've addressed that. So one of the ones that was close to where I grew up, which is not going to be in the 13th Ward, but Burns School, they had the mobile classrooms for, 20 years maybe, a long time. And they finally built a big extension onto the school. Some of the other elementary and middle schools in the 13th Ward I know are in a similar situation. I'd like to see that addressed. I also know I've heard from some folks that Kennedy High School has a lot of overcrowding, and we need to figure out what we can do there. There's a lot to do in terms of school infrastructure, and I definitely think that's something that people are interested in, because that's a lot of your tax dollars go into schools. So that's something we want to make sure we have top quality schools.
Thank you. Next question. The 13th Ward has recently seen an increase in carjackings, car theft, catalytic converter theft. How would you address this rise in incidents for concerned residents in the 13th Ward?
Yeah, so the 13th Ward is interesting because we, compared to a lot of areas in the city, crime remains relatively low in the 13th Ward. But I've been to a lot of the CAPS meetings, and we have seen increases in pretty much every category that they track. In the last year or two, those numbers have been up. Some of them are up a lot, some are up a little, but everything's sort of trending in the wrong direction, right? So that's something I know that the 8th District Police Force is aware of. They've talked at the CAPS meetings about it. It's something that's on their strategic plan for the year. The 8th District, about 5 years ago, there were about 400 police officers detailed to the 8th District. And as of the end of 2022, that number was closer to 300, right? So we have a lot fewer police officers than we did. They're stretched very thin. They're working very long hours. There was an Inspector General report last year about officers having to work 10, 11 days in a row in some cases. So there do need to be some more police officers, right? We're stretching people too thin. We're stressing out the people we have. And that's not safe for police. It's not safe for residents. We do need to focus on that. And so specific to those sort of incidents in the 13th Ward, I think that's one of the things we can do. But more broadly, there's a lot we can do about public safety in Chicago, and I think we need to really think about police as one element of public safety, but not the entirety of the public safety system. So I would like to see the city's mental health team response pilot program expanded. I think that's something that's really critical to getting police out of some of those mental health interactions. I think investing in social services, education, violence interruption, these are all great ways to reduce the incidence of crime in the first place, not just responding to crime when it occurs.
Daily constituent services such as snow removal, garbage cleanup are really important to many folks in the 13th Ward. How would you balance budgeting these services as well as other priorities you may have?
I think in the 13th Ward, people are really conditioned to understand the alderman's office as a constituent services office, right? Now that's one element of what an alderman does, and it's an important element, but it's not the only thing, right? Aldermen are legislators, and they set policy, they set the budget for the city. So definitely, maintaining constituent services is a major concern of mine. Years ago, about 10, 12 years ago now, I interned in a ward office elsewhere in the city. I was in the first ward, which is sort of Wicker Park. And I was about 6 months, I was an intern there, and my job was to answer the phone, take 311 requests, and make sure those things got done, make sure the tree got trimmed, make sure the garbage got picked up, make sure the snow got removed. I know how that works. I've seen it up front. And that's not something that's going to suddenly disappear, if I become the alderman. But I will say, I feel like the 13th Ward and Marty Quinn have really tried to convince people that there's they've just realized some magic formula to constituent services that nobody else has figured out. People across the city get these services, right? This is not something that only the 13th Ward has got. So it's not a special favor that they're doing for you, right? This is the job. This is the job of being the alderman, is to respond to those things. So, it's not something I'm going to stop doing, but I'm going to do it while also focusing on these bigger issues, these bigger policy concerns, while working with people across the city.
How would you preserve existing economic corridors in the 13th Ward and also assist local businesses in keeping their doors open?
One of the things that's really striking to me in the 13th Ward is how many vacant storefronts we've got. I honestly don't understand it, right? Now, some of it's the pandemic. I understand that, right? A lot of small businesses got hit very hard. But the 13th Ward is relative to a lot of areas, we're decently well off, right, in terms of income and wealth. So I'm always struck when there are these businesses that go vacant and they stay vacant for years and years and years. And I always talk about, Archer and Narragansett in particular is one that is so vacant. I don't understand what's going on there. So I want to work actively with businesses, with entrepreneurs to try to recruit people into the neighborhood, to try to get them to open businesses. I think that's good for existing businesses, right? The more you can bring businesses in, the more foot traffic you're bringing to the corridor. One of the things I'd like to do is really talk with residents and find out what are the services, the things you want to do or buy that you can't get in the neighborhood, right? When do you have to leave? When do you have to drive to Bedford Park? When do you drive out to Countryside? When you have to leave the city and go to the place you want to go to buy the thing you need? And let's bring businesses in that provide those things, right? That makes sense, right? That makes the community more walkable, it makes it more sustainable, and it's good for business development.
We're now getting to the questions that we're asking each candidate in each ward. So food insecurity has become an even more pressing issue in recent years, and many Southwest Side residents are not eligible for federal programs because of their immigration status, not meeting income requirements, or other factors. Similarly, grocery stores closing or not being there in the first place. As a city council member, how would you address food insecurity in your neighborhoods?
This is another area where the 13th Ward is relatively well situated in terms of grocery stores. We do have a fair number of options right now. That doesn't mean food insecurity is not a concern, but that particular aspect is pretty well taken care of. But I have seen this up close, so I spent a lot of the pandemic volunteering with the Greater Chicago Food Depository. I did emergency food box repackaging, and I did a little bit of the fresh truck. I don't know if anybody's volunteered before, but you give out produce to people. So and those lines, people line up, and they're lined up around the block, and for 2.5 hours, you're passing out food, right? There's a huge need. The food insecurity was a problem before the pandemic. It's up since the pandemic, and it seems to be staying there. Inflation's not helping with that. There were some policies at the federal level. The child tax credit did a lot to put a dent into food insecurity because it put money back in families' pockets. That has expired. It's not looking like that's likely to get renewed anytime soon. So that falls then to state and local government to try to make up that difference, right? So we need to find ways that we're making sure that families have the money they need to make the choices. Whether they're eligible for all benefits or not, we can find ways to make sure that they get tax credits or things that'll allow them to buy the things they need. And this is a public health concern, right? That this is people who don't have appropriate nutrition, have all sorts of health complications, and so we need to address that at the front end, so we're not having to address it, at the back end.
And next question, how would you work with other Southwest Side City Council members to address issues that affect the entire region?
Yeah, so this goes back to the thing I was saying before about, I think, the 13th Ward has been very insular over the years. Politics can be sort of petty, and Chicago politics in particular can be very petty. I'm not interested in any of that, right? I'll talk to anybody. I'll work with anybody. I hope that it sounds like the folks. I think a lot of the candidates who are here tonight would be prepared to work in good faith to try to advance some things regionally. I'll tell you too, I think one of the things that happens a lot in Chicago politics is because aldermen have such control within their wards, there's always this sort of competition about, I want the development in my ward because then I have control over it. I don't really care about all that, right? If you live on, Kamensky and something opens up east of Pulaski, you don't care that that's in a different ward, right? That doesn't matter to you because it's 2 blocks away, right? What you care about is what are the services, what are the businesses available to me. So, I'm not going to be sort of jealous about trying to get development from my ward. I want it to benefit the community, and if it means that it falls just outside the boundaries, that doesn't matter. So making sure that we're thinking bigger. We're thinking about the region, we're thinking about the city. It's not just about what do I personally get out of it. It's about how are we helping residents, how are we promoting the whole city.
Thank you. And our last question, will you commit to regular town halls and community meetings if you were to be elected alderman?
Absolutely. I love public meetings. This is wonderful. I have done, over the course of January, I've done 6 town halls already. I have one coming up this Saturday at the West Lawn Library, 2 p.m. If anybody's interested, come on out and see me. It's like I said, this isn't something we get a lot in the 13th Ward. It's been a long time. I mean, occasionally at the CAPS meetings, people will show up and talk, but it's not super common for elected officials to just make themselves available and just without knowing what the questions are going to be, right? I didn't know when I walked up here what all these questions were going to be. So there's a sort of an amount of trust and vulnerability. You have to put yourself out there and sort of be responsive to residents, and that's not something we get a lot right now. I absolutely want to do that if I'm elected. I think we need to do a lot more of that. I will say I'd like to see a lot more community engagement, a lot more conversations around policy, a lot more conversations around budgeting, get resident input on what are the things you care about, what are the things you need. And I think one of the ways to do that is the town hall meetings. I also think a ward night, that was somebody else had mentioned previously. So when I was an intern years ago, we did something similar with Monday nights. The office was open, I think, till 8 or 9. So people who work during the day can come and meet with their representative and make requests and get the information they need. And that's something I would commit to as well.
Thank you to the audience members who submitted questions ahead of time. That's all the questions that we have. So now we'll go to our 60-second closing remarks.
Okay, well, thank you again for having me. Thanks to the Southwest Collective. Thank you, Madison, for hosting. So as we said, my name is Paul Bruton. I'm running for Alderman of the 13th Ward. I'm a longtime resident of the area, grew up in Garfield Ridge. I live there now with my wife and 2 kids. I went to St. Daniel the Prophet School, and actually in grade school I played soccer right out here on the field at Curie. We had tournaments. We were pretty good, I'll say. But I'm running because the 13th Ward has a corruption problem, right? As I said, the Mike Madigan remains the committeeman despite a DOJ indictment. The 13th Ward Democratic Organization in the indictment is named as being part of a criminal enterprise. I've talked to neighbors who've told me about intimidation and harassment that they have faced over the years. I've talked to business owners who say they've been harassed by the current organization. And I, for one, I'm tired of it, right? We deserve honest government all the time. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter who you know. You deserve services because you live here, period. So, I'm running because I want you to have a choice in this election, and I want you to know that your vote matters this time around. And I hope that you'll support me as I try to make some changes in the area.
And for anybody who lives in the 13th Ward, when early voting begins on February 13th, the 13th Ward early voting location is in the Clearing Library. Again, you can vote in any of the ward level early votings, not just the one that you live in, but it might be the most convenient. So 13th Ward, Clearing Library.